My name is Cassidy, 30 years old, and until last week I believed family meant unconditional love. I was staring at a text message from my father that read, "Plans changed. You and your daughter are not coming. Your sister only wants real family on the cruise." That same day, I canceled every payment, sold the luxury house my entire family was living in rent-free, and left town. When they returned, the house was gone, the locks changed, and I had 68 missed calls. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you ever protected your child from toxic relatives. The pink suitcase lay open on the bed in my daughter Lily's room. She is 7 years old and has been counting down the days to this Caribbean cruise for 6 months. I carefully folded a tiny swimsuit, smiling as Lily danced around the room holding her snorkeling goggles. This vacation was supposed to be my reward after a grueling tax season. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. I picked it up, expecting a message from my mother about dinner reservations at the Port Hotel. They had driven down a day early to get settled. Instead, a message from my father Thomas flashed across the screen. I read the words once, then I read them again. "Plans changed. You and your daughter are not coming. Your sister only wants real family on the cruise. Do not bother driving to the port." I stared at the glowing screen. The cruelty of those words felt like a physical strike. Real family. Lily is my adopted daughter. I navigated the foster care system 3 years ago to bring her into my life. But to my parents and older sister, she was an outsider who did not match their perfect image. I told Lily to keep picking out books and stepped into the hallway. I hit the call button on my father's main contact profile. He answered on the fourth ring. I could hear clinking glasses and the booming laugh of Jamal, my African-American brother-in-law. Jamal was a crypto investor who spent more time showing off his expensive watches than working. I could hear my sister Melanie giggling. "What is this text message, Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. Thomas sighed, sounding more annoyed than apologetic. "Look," Cassidy tried to understand. "Melanie and Jamal are paying a lot for professional family portraits on the ship. They want a cohesive aesthetic. They want the picture to reflect our actual bloodline. Lily just stands out too much. It ruins the dynamic." My hand gripped the phone tight enough to crack the case. "You are telling me a 7-year-old child is ruining an aesthetic?" My mother Brenda took the phone. Her voice dripped with fake sweetness. "Cassidy, honey, be reasonable. Your father is meeting very important business partners on the cruise. Wealthy investors. He wants to project an established traditional image. Explaining your situation with Lily is just too complicated. We want to relax, not answer questions about why your kid looks nothing like the rest of us." I could hear Melanie shouting in the background. "Tell her I am not cropping a random kid out of my vacation photos." Jamal chimed in right after her. "Yeah, tell the accountant to stay home and crunch numbers. This trip is for high rollers anyway." I stood in the hallway of the house I bought, listening to the people I had supported for years laugh at my expense. My mind, trained to process data and eliminate emotion, went into overdrive. "You are excluding my daughter because she does not fit your country club photo shoot?" I asked. "It is just one trip, Cassidy." My father took the phone back. "We will bring you back a souvenir. You have plenty of work to do anyway. Just stay at the house and enjoy the quiet. Do not make this a bigger deal than it needs to be." He hung up. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly. I did not cry. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not drop to my knees and beg them to love me. I simply stood there in the absolute silence of the upstairs hallway. I looked at the hardwood floors beneath my feet. I looked at the custom molding along the ceiling. I walked slowly to the top of the staircase and looked down into the massive open-concept living room. This was a 5-bedroom luxury suburban estate. It was stunning. It was also entirely mine. I bought this property 5 years ago with my own money. When Jamal lost his shirt on terrible investments and my parents complained about their mortgage rates, I let them move in. I paid the property taxes. I paid the utilities. They lived here rent-free, treating my home like a hotel while treating me and my daughter like second-class citizens. They wanted to talk about high rollers. They wanted to talk about a cohesive aesthetic and real family. My father told me to stay at the house and enjoy the quiet. A chilling sense of clarity washed over me. Every ounce of familial guilt vanished, replaced by pure, calculating logic. I walked back into Lily's room. She looked up at me with her bright, trusting eyes, holding a pair of pink sunglasses. "Are we still going to the beach, Mommy?" she asked. I smiled at her, a genuine warm smile. "We absolutely are, sweetie. But we are going somewhere much better than that boat." I walked into my home office and sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop. I did not call them back to argue. Instead, I pulled up the contact information for a corporate real estate firm that bought luxury properties. The first domino was just about to fall. I watched the cursor blink on my screen, the silence of the empty house wrapping around me like a protective shield. I pushed back from my desk and walked down the hall to Lily's room. She had fallen asleep with her favorite picture book resting on her chest, her breathing soft and perfectly rhythmic. I gently pulled the blanket up to her chin and brushed a strand of dark hair from her forehead. She looked so peaceful, completely unaware of the viciousness that had just transpired over the phone. This sweet, innocent child was deemed not real family by the very people who slept under the roof I paid for. I turned off the bedside lamp and quietly closed her door. My grief and shock were completely gone, burned away by a sudden, absolute clarity. I was a forensic accountant. I dealt in facts, ledgers, hidden liabilities, and cold, hard numbers. And right now, looking at the situation through the lens of pure logic, my family was the biggest toxic liability on my balance sheet. It was time to liquidate the asset. I returned to my home office, sat down at my computer, and pulled up my archived professional contacts. I did not need a traditional real estate agent. I did not have the time or the patience for open houses staging or 30-day escrow periods. I needed surgical precision and brute speed. I opened the file for M&B Investments. They were a massive corporate real estate firm that specialized in aggressive all-cash acquisitions. 6 months ago, I had audited one of their subsidiaries. I knew exactly how they operated. They preyed on motivated sellers offering quick cash to bypass the usual red tape, flipping the properties later for a massive corporate profit. I was not a desperate seller, but I was a highly motivated one. I found the direct line for Gregory Dunn, a senior acquisition director I had crossed paths with during the audit. It was late on a Friday evening, but corporate sharks like Gregory never stopped working. When he answered the phone, his tone was brisk, clipped, and visibly annoyed at the late interruption. I introduced myself, reminding him of my firm and the forensic audit we had conducted on his accounts. The annoyance in his voice vanished, replaced by cautious professionalism. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I pitched the property directly. A 5-bedroom prime suburban estate, immaculate condition, newly renovated kitchen, and a meticulously landscaped yard. I told him I was willing to sell it at a straight 15% discount off the current market value for an immediate cash closing. His tone shifted instantly from cautious to predatory. Gregory arrived at my doorstep less than 2 hours later. He drove a black luxury vehicle and walked up my driveway wearing a sharp suit and a calculating expression. He stepped into the foyer, his eyes immediately scanning the custom crown, molding the pristine hardwood floors, and the expensive modern fixtures hanging above the staircase. He pulled out a laser measuring tool and a digital tablet, ready to play the usual corporate game of pointing out non-existent flaws to drive down the asking price. He walked into the kitchen, tapping his knuckles against the imported marble countertops. "It is a nice space," he said, keeping his voice carefully neutral to hide his obvious interest. "But the real estate market in this specific area is softening. We would need to run a full independent appraisal, check the foundation for settling, and inspect the air conditioning system. It usually takes a few weeks to clear our internal risk management department before we can authorize a cash transfer of this size." I leaned against the kitchen island, crossing my arms. I let him run through his standard intimidation script before I stopped him cold. "Gregory," I said, cutting him off mid-sentence, "I audited your firm. I know your internal approval matrices. I know your liquid capital reserves. You do not need a 3-week risk assessment for a property in this neighborhood, and you certainly do not need an appraisal when I am handing you built-in equity. I am offering you a fully updated estate at a massive discount. The property taxes are paid through the end of the year, the title is completely clear, and there are absolutely no liens against the house. I reached onto the counter and slid a pristine, meticulously organized folder across the granite surface. It contained the deed, the recent inspection reports, the property tax records, and a pre-drafted agreement of sale. I am not some desperate homeowner. You can nickel and dime over a loose floorboard or a scuffed baseboard. I continued, my voice steady and commanding. I am handing you a guaranteed profit margin on a silver platter. You know the math makes sense. Gregory looked at the folder, then looked at me. His predatory smile faded into a look of genuine professional respect. He opened the folder, flipping through the expertly prepared financial documents. He knew I had him cornered. The numbers were perfect, and he knew a lucrative deal when he saw one. Why the massive discount, he asked, looking up from the paperwork. People do not just throw away that kind of equity for fun. What is the catch here? The catch, I replied without missing a single beat, is the timeline. I need a 48-hour closing window. I need the cash wired into my account by Monday morning. Gregory frowned, closing the folder and tapping it with his pen. 48 hours is incredibly tight even for an all-cash corporate acquisition. The wire transfers, the title company processing, getting the legal team to sign off on the weekend. It is a logistical nightmare. I uncrossed my arms and stood up straight. Then I will call your biggest competitor down the street and offer them the same guaranteed profit. I know they have the liquidity. I am sure they will figure out the logistics for a deal this good. Gregory quickly raised a hand, stopping me before I could reach for my phone. All right, wait. We can do 48 hours. We have pushed things through faster for the right margins. But if we are waiving the appraisal and pushing this entire transaction through by Monday, there are strict conditions. The house needs to be completely vacant. We are sending our commercial renovation team in on Wednesday morning to prep it for the market. Any belongings left behind become our legal property, and we will charge you a hefty disposal fee deducted directly from the final payout. I thought about my father's luxury golf clubs sitting in the garage. I thought about my mother's expensive fine china displayed in the dining room cabinets. I thought about my sister's overflowing designer shoe collection and my brother-in-law's ridiculous expensive crypto mining computers humming away in the guest room. They were currently sailing toward the Caribbean, entirely unreachable, expecting to return to the comfortable free life they had enjoyed for years. Gregory pulled a thick commercial contract from his briefcase and laid it out on the kitchen island. He signed his portion quickly and slid the pen across the marble toward me. The terms are non-negotiable, he stated firmly, tapping the bottom of the page. We close on Monday. By Tuesday morning, this house must be completely empty. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the dotted line with smooth, deliberate strokes. I looked up at Gregory, a calm, icy smile spreading across my face. It will be. Gregory Dunn walked out the front door, the heavy oak clicking shut behind him. The moment his taillights disappeared down the quiet suburban street, I pulled out my phone. I had 48 hours to empty a sprawling 5-bedroom estate. Standard residential movers would take weeks to schedule and days to complete the job, treating every item with kid gloves. I did not have weeks, and I did not want delicate handling. I needed a rapid response liquidation crew. I searched for a premium commercial clean-out service, the kind of heavy-duty operation that specialized in corporate evictions, foreclosure clearouts, and immediate estate liquidations. I found a local company that promised a 24-hour turnaround for triple their standard rate. I did not hesitate. I paid the premium immediately with a corporate card. They guaranteed a 12-man crew at my door by 6 o'clock Saturday morning. I spent the rest of Friday night packing for Lily and myself. We did not need much. I packed 2 large suitcases of our clothing, Lily's favorite toys, her school books, and my work electronics. Everything else I owned in the house was replaceable. I piled our bags by the front door. At exactly 6 in the morning, the heavy rumble of diesel engines shook the driveway. A fleet of 3 massive white box trucks backed up to the garage. The crew chief, a burly man named Marcus, hopped out of the lead truck holding a clipboard. I handed him a master key to the house and a roll of industrial trash bags. I told him everything left inside the house was to be boxed, wrapped, and hauled away. I explicitly instructed him not to care about organizing, sorting, or labeling. There would be no careful wrapping of picture frames or gentle packing of heirlooms. I just wanted the structure completely empty down to the baseboards, and I wanted it done before the sun went down. Marcus blew a sharp whistle, and the 12-man crew swarmed the house like a highly efficient army. The systematic dismantling of 30 years of family entitlement was a spectacular sight. I stood in the grand foyer with my arms crossed, watching the crew tear through the rooms my family had arrogantly claimed as their own. Two men carried out Thomas's custom leather golf bags, the incredibly expensive ones he had bought using the emergency medical fund I had loaned him 2 years ago. They tossed the gleaming clubs into the back of a dirty truck without a second thought. Next came my mother's towering display of crystal vases and antique porcelain. She had spent decades collecting pieces to show off to her wealthy friends, insisting they required absolute silence to dust. The crew hastily wrapped them in cheap industrial bubble wrap, tossing them roughly into heavy cardboard bins. The delicate clinking of glass echoed down the hallway as her precious status symbols were hauled away like cheap garage sale leftovers. Then the crew tackled Melanie's bedroom. It took 4 grown men to empty her massive walk-in closet. Racks of designer silk dresses, endless rows of red-bottom shoes, and dozens of imported luxury handbags were unceremoniously swept into massive black trash bags. Melanie had treated my house like her personal VIP boutique, leaving her expensive garments scattered across every chair and sofa, while demanding I pay her exorbitant dry cleaning bills because she claimed the air in my laundry room ruined the fabric. Now her precious high-fashion wardrobe looked like a pile of discarded laundry. But the loudest and most satisfying part of the purge was Jamal's room. 3 sweating men groaned under the weight of his massive crypto mining rigs. These useless computers glowing with obnoxious neon lights had spiked my monthly electricity bill to astronomical levels for over a year and produced absolutely nothing of value. The crew yanked the thick power cords directly from the walls, severing his fake digital empire in a single motion. They dragged the heavy overheating servers out the front door, leaving deep scratch marks on his expensive gaming desk. I directed the convoy of trucks to a cheap off-highway storage facility on the dusty industrial edge of town. It was a bleak, unheated metal unit, sitting right next to a loud commercial truck stop miles away from our manicured suburban neighborhood. The crew unloaded the endless boxes, bags, and furniture, stacking them haphazardly to the corrugated tin ceiling. Melanie's delicate silk dresses were crushed under the sheer weight of Jamal's heavy computer servers. My mother's pristine fine china was wedged directly next to a pile of Thomas's muddy golf shoes. I walked into the dingy rental office and signed a basic lease for the massive space. I pulled out my credit card and paid for exactly 1 month, 30 days. After that, if the bill was not paid, the facility would legally auction everything off to the highest bidder. I locked the metal roll-up door, feeling the heavy mechanism click into place. I slipped the single brass padlock key into my pocket, wiped the industrial dust from my hands, and left their entire entitled existence behind in the gravel dirt. Back at the neighborhood, I loaded my car with the 2 suitcases I had saved for Lily and myself. We were not going to a temporary hotel. I had already secured an immediate short-term lease on a high-security luxury penthouse in the center of downtown. It required biometric keycard access for the private elevator and featured a relentless 24-hour concierge desk. No uninvited guests, especially angry relatives, could ever reach us there. We were completely off the grid, insulated in a fortress of concrete and glass. The clean-out crew finished their final sweep, wiping down the counters and locking the windows. They left the 5-bedroom suburban house entirely vacant. The walls echoed with a hollow, satisfying sound. I sent Marcus and his team away with a generous cash tip and locked the heavy front door for the last time. Inside, I sat down on the single cardboard moving box I had deliberately kept behind in the center of the empty living room. The physical purge was complete. Every trace of their toxic presence, every physical reminder of how they had used me was gone. My house was a blank slate ready for the corporate buyers to wire the funds. Now it was time for the financial purge. I pulled my tablet from my bag and connected to the secure cellular network, bringing up the cruise line's official online portal. The glowing screen of my tablet was the only source of light remaining in the cavernous, entirely empty living room. I sat on the single cardboard box I had kept behind, staring at the cruise line's official web portal. It was a bright, cheerful web page featuring a massive luxury ocean liner cutting through turquoise waters. Under my account profile, the reservation flashed in bold, unmistakable letters: the Wilson Family Vacation. 7 nights, 8 days cruising through the Eastern Caribbean. A digital countdown timer at the top of the screen cheerfully announced that boarding would commence in exactly 4 hours. My thumb hovered over the red cancellation button at the bottom of the page. It would be so incredibly easy to press it. One firm tap, and their digital boarding passes would instantly invalidate. They would reach the port security checkpoint, hand over their passports, and be turned away at the gate in front of hundreds of people. But that was too quick. That was a localized, temporary embarrassment. If they were turned away in Florida, they would just rent a car, drive back to my house, and throw a massive tantrum on my front lawn. I needed them far away. I needed them completely isolated in international waters when the reality of their situation finally hit them. I moved my thumb away from the cancellation button. They were going to board that ship. They just were not going to enjoy a single second of it. Modern cruise ships operate on a strictly cashless system. Every cocktail, every premium dining experience, every shore excursion, and every hour of satellite internet requires a plastic keycard linked directly to a primary financial account. My family had demanded I link my platinum corporate card to all 4 of their individual cruise profiles. They had spent weeks bragging about the expensive spa packages they planned to book and the premium drink packages they intended to abuse on my dime. I navigated to the financial management tab of the reservation. I clicked on the profiles for Thomas, Brenda, Melanie, and Jamal. One by one, I highlighted my credit card number attached to their accounts and hit delete. The system prompted me to enter a new payment method. I left the fields entirely blank. A warning message popped up on the screen stating that without a valid card on file, the passengers would have zero onboard purchasing power. Their keycards would be restricted to basic cabin entry and the free buffet. There would be no premium internet access for Melanie to post her aesthetic photos. There would be no overpriced cocktails by the pool for Jamal to maintain his fake high roller image. I hit save. But cutting off their spending money was just the beginning. I navigated back to the main booking screen and pulled up the cabin assignments. 6 months ago, in a desperate attempt to buy my father's approval and make the trip special for my mother, I had paid an exorbitant premium to upgrade their reservations. I had booked them the presidential suite, a massive 2-story luxury cabin featuring a private balcony, a hot tub, and personalized butler service. It was the absolute crown jewel of the ship, the exact kind of status symbol my father needed to impress his wealthy business partners. I clicked on the billing history for the upgrade. The charge had been processed as a secondary payment separate from the initial booking. I opened a new tab logged directly into my bank's fraud department portal and initiated a permanent chargeback for the suite upgrade fee. I cited a breach of contract regarding the passenger manifest, which was technically true since the manifest had been altered without my consent as the primary account holder. I knew exactly how the cruise line's automated billing system worked. It would flag the reversed payment within hours of departure. When the financial system realized the $10,000 suite upgrade was unpaid, it would automatically attempt to charge the default card on file to recover the balance. But I had just deleted the default card. The financial failure would trigger an immediate mandatory cabin reassignment. Security would violently boot them from the presidential suite and relocate them to whatever bottom-tier windowless interior cabin was left over in the bowels of the ship right next to the engine room. The ship was taken care of. Now I needed to ensure they had no easy way back. I closed the cruise portal and opened my airline application. I had booked their round-trip first-class flights using my frequent flyer miles and my primary travel card. Their return flight was scheduled to depart from Miami International Airport next Sunday at noon. I pulled up the confirmation number. The airline policy allowed for full cancellations up to 24 hours before departure. I did not hesitate. I checked the boxes next to the names Thomas, Brenda, Melanie, and Jamal. I clicked cancel. The system processed the request instantly, deleting their boarding passes from the cloud and returning the massive cache of flight credits directly into my personal account. They were now officially stranded in Florida with absolutely no transportation home. They had zero spending money, no luxury suite, and no return flights. The financial artery that had sustained their blind entitlement for my entire adult life was permanently and completely severed. I looked at the massive balance of reclaimed travel credits sitting in my airline account. I refused to let them go to waste. I navigated to the new booking page and typed in Honolulu. I selected 2 first-class seats departing from my city tomorrow morning. I entered my name and Lily's name. We were going to get our tropical vacation after all, far away from the toxic reach of my family. I chose the premium seats with the lie-flat beds. I added the VIP lounge access. I reviewed the final itinerary. A week in a luxury beachfront resort on Waikiki Beach, just me and my daughter, surrounded by real love and absolute peace. The total cost was entirely covered by the refunded tickets of the people who had tried to cast us aside. I hovered my finger over the final confirmation button. The empty, hollow sounds of the vacant house surrounded me. There was no more screaming, no more insults, no more demands, just the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly executed ledger. I pressed confirm. The screen flashed a bright green checkmark indicating the transaction was successful. I powered down the tablet, stood up in the center of the dark living room, and smiled. Let them swim home. I tucked my tablet securely into my leather bag and walked out the front door, pulling it shut until the heavy deadbolt engaged with a satisfying metallic click. The drive to the downtown financial district took less than 20 minutes. The towering glass structure of the Ascend building rose against the night sky, a fortress of modern architecture and absolute privacy. I pulled my car into the secure underground garage, flashing my new biometric pass to the armed guard at the steel gate. We took the private express elevator straight to the top floor. When the polished steel doors parted, Lily gasped aloud. The penthouse was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic sweep of the city skyline, the urban lights glittering below us like a sea of scattered diamonds. It was fully furnished in sleek minimalist tones featuring clean lines and expansive open spaces. It was a sharp, refreshing contrast to the cluttered, chaotic suburban house we had just abandoned to the corporate liquidators. More importantly, it was entirely off the grid. My name was not listed on any public registry here. The lease was held securely under a blind corporate LLC I had formed years ago for financial privacy. My parents, Melanie and Jamal, could scour the entire state, and they would never make it past the heavily guarded lobby desk. I watched Lily run her hands over the cool leather sofa and spin in a joyful circle on the plush rug. We ordered room service from the 24-hour concierge, eating gourmet macaroni and cheese while looking out over the sleeping city. Later that night, as I tucked Lily into the crisp white sheets of the expansive guest bedroom, the excitement of our new space began to fade. It was replaced by the quiet, hesitant confusion of a 7-year-old trying to understand adult cruelty. She pulled her stuffed bear tight against her chest, her dark eyes looking up at me in the dim light of the bedside lamp. "Mommy," she asked, her voice small and delicate. "Why are we not going on the big boat with Grandpa and Aunt Melanie? Did I do something wrong?" The question pierced my chest. It was the exact moment I had been dreading, the inevitable collision of their toxic vanity with her innocent heart. I sat on the edge of the thick mattress and took her small hand in mine. "No, sweetie," I said, keeping my voice incredibly gentle but firm with absolute certainty. "You did absolutely nothing wrong. You are perfect exactly the way you are." "Then why did they leave us behind?" She pressed, a slight quiver echoing in her voice. I took a deep breath, carefully choosing my words. I needed her to understand this reality without absorbing a single drop of their poison. I needed to build an impenetrable armor around her heart. Sometimes people think that being a family just means you share the exact same blood, or that you look the same, or that you take the same kinds of pictures for other people to see. I explained, brushing a dark curl from her forehead. But that is not what makes a family real. Family is not about blood or matching outfits. Family is about how you treat people. It is about respect, protection, and showing up for each other with unconditional love no matter what. Grandpa and Aunt Melanie forgot what respect means. They care much more about how things look on the outside than how they feel on the inside. I squeezed her hand gently, making sure she held my gaze. I will never let anyone treat you like you do not belong. Not ever. So we are going on our own adventure, just the two of us, to a place where we are celebrated, not hidden away. Lily seemed to absorb the words, the tension slowly leaving her small shoulders. She nodded, offering a sleepy, reassured smile. A real adventure, she murmured, her eyes fluttering shut. I sat there in the quiet luxury of the room until her breathing deepened into a steady rhythm. I made a silent, unbreakable vow that the people currently floating on that cruise ship would never be allowed to make her feel small again. The next morning, a private black car took us directly to the airport. We bypassed the crowded main terminal, entirely moving swiftly through the expedited VIP security lane. In the first-class lounge, Lily happily ate fresh strawberries and watched the massive planes take off through the viewing windows. When we boarded our flight to Honolulu, the flight attendants greeted us by name and directed us to our spacious lie-flat pods. We settled in, wrapped in soft amenities, as the plane taxied down the runway. As we ascended through the clouds, leaving the mainland far behind, I felt a profound sense of physical and emotional distance from the impending wreckage of my former life. Over the Pacific Ocean, Lily watched animated movies with noise-canceling headphones while I enjoyed a glass of complimentary champagne. I did the math in my head, cross-referencing the time zones. Right about now, Thomas, Brenda, Melanie, and Jamal would be wrapping up their first sunny day at sea. They would be actively preparing for the highly anticipated Captain's Dinner, the exact formal VIP event Melanie had curated her stolen designer wardrobe for. They would be heading to the premium dining room, fully expecting to flash their room keys and drink top-shelf wine on my limitless corporate tab. Hours later, the plane touched down smoothly on the sun-baked tarmac of Daniel K. Inouye International Airport. The cabin filled with the faint scent of tropical flowers and the warm Hawaiian breeze as the heavy doors opened. Lily grabbed my hand, practically vibrating with excitement as we walked up the jet bridge into the vibrant, bustling terminal. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. It had been strictly on airplane mode since we left our city. I swiped the screen, disabling the flight settings to connect to the local cellular network. The moment the signal bars turned solid, the device violently vibrated in my palm. It buzzed again and again. A rapid, endless succession of digital chimes flooded the speaker, the screen illuminated with dozens of missed call notifications and urgent text alerts. But it was the bright red voicemail indicator that caught my eye. I had one new message marked highly urgent, sent directly via an expensive satellite connection from the middle of the ocean. I tapped the icon and pressed the speaker to my ear. Jamal's voice blared through the tiny speaker laced with heavy static from the expensive maritime satellite connection. I immediately pressed pause. Lily was tugging at my sleeve, pointing eagerly toward the bustling baggage claim carousel, where our suitcases were just sliding down the ramp. I slipped the phone into my purse and offered her a bright, relaxed smile. The absolute meltdown waiting for me in the digital cloud could wait another hour. I wanted the perfect, undisturbed setting to fully savor this symphony of panic. We grabbed our luggage and stepped out of the terminal into the glorious sun-drenched paradise of Oahu. We took a private car directly to our luxury resort on Waikiki Beach. The transition from the sterile airport to the lush, vibrant resort was seamless. Within an hour, Lily was wearing her new floral swimsuit, happily building a massive sandcastle right at the edge of the crystal-clear water. I settled into a plush, shaded lounge chair under the wide fronds of a palm tree. A smiling attendant brought me a fresh pineapple smoothie, decorated with a vibrant pink orchid. The warm trade winds brushed against my skin, carrying the scent of salt and blooming hibiscus. I sank back into the comfortable cushions, pulled my phone from my bag, and pressed play on the paused voicemail. "Cassidy, what the hell did you do?" Jamal's voice exploded through the speaker, vibrating with a level of rage and humiliation I had never heard from him before. He was breathing heavily, practically spitting his words into the receiver. "We just tried to get into the VIP captain's dinner. Do you have any idea what just happened to us?" I took a slow, refreshing sip of my smoothie, letting the sweet tropical fruit coat my tongue, as Jamal painted a vivid picture of their spectacular social destruction. He described the scene in furious detail. The entire family had dressed to the nines. Thomas was wearing his bespoke tuxedo, Brenda had draped herself in expensive jewelry, and Melanie was wearing one of the stolen designer silk gowns she had brought specifically to show off. They had marched up to the velvet rope at the entrance of the ship's most exclusive dining room, ready to mingle with high-rolling investors and wealthy vacationers. The maitre d' had smiled politely and asked for a key card to process the mandatory premium seating deposit. Jamal confidently handed over his card. The machine flashed a bright, angry red. "Declined." Jamal scoffed, assuming it was a simple technical error, and told Thomas to use his card. The machine beeped harshly again. "Declined." Panic began to set in as Brenda and Melanie practically shoved their cards at the staff member. Denied and denied. By this point, a long line of incredibly wealthy, impatient passengers had formed behind them. Jamal described how the maitre d' lost his welcoming smile, his tone dropping to a cold, dismissive whisper as he politely asked the completely unfunded family to step aside. Security was called to escort them away from the VIP area, directing them to the crowded, noisy, complimentary buffet on Deck 4. Jamal was screaming into the phone about how I had intentionally humiliated him in front of powerful corporate executives he was actively trying to network with. But Jamal's bruised ego was not the main event. Behind his furious tirade, the background noise on the voicemail was pure, unadulterated chaos. Melanie was sobbing loudly. It was not her usual manipulative crying, but a shrill, hysterical wail that pierced right through the phone speaker. I could hear her screaming at someone in the background, frantically demanding to speak to the ship's hospitality director. Jamal shifted the phone, his angry whisper morphing into a panicked, breathless shout. He told me that the dinner humiliation was just the beginning. Right after they were turned away from the dining room, they retreated to the presidential suite to figure out what was wrong with their accounts. But their keycards would not unlock the heavy double doors. Instead, the ship's purser was standing there flanked by 3 thick-necked maritime security officers. The cruise line's financial department had been alerted that the $10,000 chargeback for the suite upgrade had cleared my bank. Because the luxury cabin was now officially unpaid, and the family could not provide a single valid credit card to cover the massive balance, the ship invoked its strict eviction policy. The security officers stood over them and forced them to pack their bags immediately. Jamal sounded completely broken as he described the public march of shame. The officers escorted them through the crowded corridors, making them carry their own heavy luggage in front of hundreds of staring passengers. They were marched all the way down to the bowels of the ship. Because the vessel was sailing at full capacity, the only available room left to accommodate their unpaid status was a windowless bottom-tier interior cabin on the lowest possible passenger deck. Jamal practically sobbed into the receiver as he described their new reality. They were shoved into a claustrophobic space roughly the size of my walk-in closet. There was no balcony, no natural light, and absolutely no butler service. Worse, the cheap cabin shared a thin steel wall directly with the ship's massive engine room. Over Jamal's frantic whispering, I could hear the relentless, deafening mechanical thumping of the massive diesel engines vibrating the room. Melanie was wailing uncontrollably in the background, shrieking about the overwhelming smell of exhaust fumes and how the intense vibrations were literally shaking the thin mattresses off the floor. The voicemail cut off abruptly, likely because Jamal had hit the strict time limit for the outrageously expensive satellite connection he had desperately used to call me. I lowered the phone to my lap and looked out at the tranquil turquoise ocean. Lily was giggling as a gentle wave washed over her toes, entirely safe and completely unaware of the miserable mechanical prison currently trapping the people who had tried to discard her. My phone chimed softly in my hand. A second voicemail had downloaded. This one was from Thomas. I tapped the screen and brought the speaker back to my ear. My father's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. It vibrated with the kind of dark, authoritative rage he had used to terrorize and control me my entire life. He did not ask for an explanation. He did not ask if Lily and I were safe. He bypassed all human decency and went straight for absolute dominance. "You have made the biggest mistake of your miserable life, Cassidy," he snarled, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "You think this is a game. You think you can publicly humiliate my wife and my children and just get away with it. You have ruined a once-in-a-lifetime vacation. You are going to fix these credit cards right now, or there will be severe consequences. Do you hear me?" He took a sharp, rattling breath, delivering his final, uncompromising threat. "When we get back to our house, I am throwing all your stuff on the lawn and kicking you out." The message ended with a harsh, decisive click. I pulled the phone away from my ear, letting the warm Hawaiian breeze wash over my face. I looked at the bright blue sky and the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean stretching out before me. A soft, genuine chuckle bubbled up from my chest, escaping my lips in a quiet burst of absolute joy. I leaned back against the plush cushions of my lounge chair, savoring the spectacular irony of his furious empty promise. I raised my tropical smoothie to the horizon and whispered to the warm ocean air. "What house?" The warm, tropical breeze blowing across the pristine Hawaiian beach suddenly felt entirely secondary to the icy, calculating focus settling over my mind. I lowered the phone to my lap, the echo of my father's furious voice still ringing in my ears. His threat to throw my belongings onto the lawn of a house I no longer owned was laughable, but beneath the absurdity lay a deeply ingrained, dangerous arrogance. He genuinely believed he possessed absolute authority over my life, my property, and my assets. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who held a trump card. My amusement vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, razor-edged instincts of a senior forensic auditor. I did not survive in the high-stakes world of corporate financial investigation by ignoring threats. Where there was unearned arrogance, there was usually hidden leverage. If he felt that confident threatening my physical property, I needed to know exactly what kind of access he still retained to my digital existence. I stood up from the lounge chair, brushing the white sand from my legs. I guided Lily away from the shoreline, promising her a massive plate of fresh pineapple and a movie marathon in our suite. The luxury resort was a sprawling oasis of calm, but my mind was already shifting into a sterile digital battlefield. We took the private elevator up to our suite. I settled Lily onto the massive sectional sofa, ordering a spread of tropical fruit from room service, and made sure she was completely engrossed in her favorite animated film. With my daughter safe and distracted, I retreated to the heavy mahogany desk in the corner of the living area. I pulled my secure company-issued laptop from my leather carry-on bag, plugged it into the wall, and established a heavily encrypted virtual private network connection. It was time to scorch the earth digitally, leaving absolutely nothing for them to exploit. My first target was the family cloud drive. For over a decade, I had been the silent administrative backbone of our entire family structure. I paid the exorbitant monthly fees for the premium unlimited storage tier, where they dumped every single digital artifact of their lives. I brought up the master control panel and began systematically executing the purge. I started with Melanie completely revoking her access and permanently deleting terabytes of her superficial, heavily edited social media photo shoots. Next, I severed Jamal's administrative permissions, wiping out the shared streaming platforms and expensive software subscriptions I had been unknowingly funding for his ridiculous gaming setups. I moved through the digital ledger with the exact same ruthless clinical efficiency the rapid response crew had used to strip my physical house down to the baseboards. I was erasing their digital lifelines one by one, ensuring no lingering banking details, utility autopays, or shared recovery emails remained tied to my personal identity. I finally turned my attention to my parents' master directory. I highlighted the massive folder containing their mundane vacation itineraries, old tax returns, and shared household maintenance records, preparing to send the entire digital archive into the incinerator. But as my cursor hovered over the permanent deletion command, my trained eye caught a glaring structural anomaly. Deep within a nested, seemingly innocent maze of subfolders labeled with generic insurance quotes and outdated medical receipts, there was a localized disruption in the file architecture. It was a compressed directory that had been manually hidden from the primary user interface. More importantly, it was heavily encrypted. I leaned closer to the high-resolution screen, my professional instincts flaring into high alert. My father was a boastful, loud man, but he was completely technologically illiterate. He typed with two rigid index fingers and routinely asked me to reset his email passwords. He would never possess the technical foresight to utilize an encrypted digital vault unless he was actively, deliberately trying to hide something of immense value from the person who administered the network. The file size of the hidden directory was suspiciously large, far too massive for a collection of simple text documents or scanned appliance warranties. In the world of forensic accounting, an anomaly like this was a glowing neon sign pointing directly towards systemic fraud. Where there was digital smoke, there was inevitably a blazing financial fire. He had used a basic commercially available encryption software, likely assuming the average person would simply ignore a locked file or assume it was a system error. But I was not an average person. I audited the complex financial structures of Fortune 500 companies for a living. I routinely dismantled offshore money laundering schemes and tracked phantom assets through layers of corporate shell companies. This flimsy suburban security measure was child's play. I minimized the cloud drive and fired up my accounting firm's proprietary forensic decryption tool. It was a heavy-duty aggressive software suite specifically designed to tear through weak civilian security protocols and force entry into locked directories. I linked the auditing software directly to the hidden folder on the cloud drive and initiated the bypass sequence. The screen went dark, immediately replaced by rapid cascading lines of green code as the program relentlessly hammered against his digital lock. I sat perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic clicking of my own breathing. I did not have to wait long. Less than 3 minutes after I initiated the breach, the weak encryption algorithm shattered completely. The software flashed a bright access granted notification, and the hidden folder violently unzipped, spilling its entire classified contents directly across my desktop. I opened the first master file in the directory, bracing myself to find hidden offshore accounts. A secret retirement fund he was keeping from my mother, or perhaps evidence of embezzlement from his former business partners. What I actually saw made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. My hands went numb as I rapidly clicked through a dizzying, terrifying array of scanned PDF documents, complex legal contracts, and notarized loan applications. They were not his documents, they were mine. Staring back at me from the bright glow of the monitor were multiple high-yield loan agreements, secondary property mortgages, and massive lines of corporate credit. Every single document was legally bound to my identity. Every single page displayed my private social security number, my date of birth, and my exact financial history. And sitting at the absolute bottom of each legally binding contract, stamped heavily by a licensed notary public, was a flawless, heavily practiced, and utterly devastating forgery of my signature. Thomas had not just been living rent-free under my roof, draining my daily resources to fund his arrogant lifestyle. He had secretly and systematically anchored a catastrophic mountain of toxic, hidden financial liabilities directly to my name. The gloves were completely off, and my transition from a frustrated daughter to a clinical, relentless forensic investigator was instantaneous. The warm Hawaiian breeze drifting through the open balcony doors faded into the background, replaced entirely by the rhythmic, purposeful clatter of my fingertips against the keyboard. The sheer audacity of the crime sitting on my desktop required absolute, unwavering focus. I was no longer looking at an annoying family secret. I was staring into the dark, gaping maw of a massive criminal conspiracy orchestrated by the men who shared my bloodline. I cracked my knuckles, took a slow sip of my smoothie, and began the meticulous process of performing a digital autopsy on my own stolen financial life. I needed to establish the exact timeline, the total velocity of the theft, and the undeniable chain of custody for every single stolen dollar. I launched a specialized blockchain explorer, a high-grade analytical tool I typically reserve for unraveling corporate embezzlement schemes. I fed the receiving addresses from Jamal's digital wallets into the search matrix and initiated a comprehensive historical trace. The blockchain is entirely unforgiving. It is a permanent, immutable public ledger that records every transaction with absolute mathematical certainty. Jamal clearly believed that cryptocurrency was anonymous, but he possessed the operational security of a careless teenager. He had made no effort to tumble the coins or mask his digital footprint. The transaction map populated on my screen, blooming into a chaotic, sprawling web of inbound cash and outbound expenditures. The sheer volume of the inbound transfers perfectly mirrored the exact dates and amounts of the high-interest shadow loans Thomas had fraudulently executed using my forged signature. Thomas would secure the predatory line of credit against my home equity route, the cash through a series of flimsy domestic shell accounts, and wire it directly into the digital exchanges where Jamal was waiting. But it was the outbound flow of the money that truly showcased the pathetic, vain reality of my brother's existence. Jamal was not a visionary day trader or an angel investor navigating the complex world of decentralized finance. He was a spectacular, catastrophic failure who used my stolen identity to fund an entirely fabricated reality. I tracked the outbound digital hashes, matching them to public vendor wallets. He had not lost the money in a volatile market crash. He had spent it. He had wired thousands of dollars in Bitcoin to a luxury car rental agency in Miami to lease Lamborghinis for his weekend social media photo shoots. He had transferred Ethereum to offshore bot farms in Eastern Europe, paying them to artificially inflate his online subscriber count and flood his posts with fake engagement. He had even used my stolen equity to buy a seat at exclusive VIP tables in high-end nightclubs, posing as a mysterious self-made crypto king for people he was desperate to impress. He had literally funded his hustle culture podcast by having our father forge my signature on loan documents that carried 30% interest rates. I opened a subfolder within Thomas's encrypted directory and found the true depth of his complicity. This was not a one-time mistake or a desperate act of a father trying to bail out a struggling son. It was a highly organized monthly routine. Thomas had created his own meticulous spreadsheets. He had actively monitored my credit score fluctuations using a stolen background check authorization. He had calculated the exact amount of equity I possessed in my suburban home, treating my financial stability like a personal, bottomless automated teller machine. He had drafted practice sheets scanning multiple versions of my signature until he had perfected the forgery. He was the architect of my intended ruin, using his arrogant patriarchal authority to justify stealing from his own daughter to prop up his golden son. I exported the data from the shadow lenders, the shell accounts, and the blockchain ledgers, dumping everything into a dynamic master spreadsheet. I linked every forged legal document to its corresponding wire transfer, creating an unbreakable chronological chain of evidence. I commanded the software to calculate the aggregate total of the fraudulent liabilities they had anchored to my name. The final number materialized at the bottom of the screen in a bold, undeniable red font: $842,000. They had stolen nearly $1 million in my name. I sat back in the heavy mahogany desk chair and stared at that devastating number. For 34 years, I had bent over backwards trying to win their affection. I had hosted their dinners, paid their bills, endured their constant insults, and smiled through the pain, believing that underneath the toxicity, we were still a family. But this number was the ultimate, inescapable truth. They did not just lack empathy, they lacked basic human decency. To them, I was not a daughter or a sister. I was a host organism. I was a disposable resource to be harvested until I was entirely depleted. The reality of what they had intended for me settled over my shoulders like a heavy winter coat. If I had not silently executed the formation of my blind trust, sold the property, and vanished from the grid, these aggressive, unregulated shadow lenders would have inevitably come knocking. I would have faced immediate foreclosure, total bankruptcy, and absolute professional ruin. Thomas and Jamal would have watched me lose my home, my career, and my dignity, and they would have blamed me for it. They would have shaken their heads at my failure while continuing to live comfortably under my roof. They intended to sentence me to a lifetime of indentured servitude without a second thought. My heart, which had ached for their love, my entire life turned to absolute unyielding ice. I opened a blank, highly secure dossier file on my desktop. I began compiling the final evidence package. I dragged in every Internet Protocol address log from our old home router, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the fraudulent loan applications originated from Thomas's laptop in the downstairs office, and the crypto receipts were authorized from Jamal's desktop in the guest bedroom. I attached the metadata tags, proving Thomas had created and altered the PDF loan documents. I embedded the high-resolution blockchain trace reports showing the exact uninterrupted flow of funds from the predatory lenders directly to the luxury car rental agencies and bot farms. I began to classify the crimes, typing out the section headers with the clinical, ruthless precision of a federal prosecutor. Aggravated identity theft, bank fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit grand larceny. This was no longer a petty familial dispute over a ruined vacation or unpaid credit card bills. These were severe, undeniable federal crimes carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences. By utilizing international crypto exchanges and routing stolen funds across state lines, they had triggered the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I finalized the digital package, locking the comprehensive dossier behind military-grade encryption and routing a secure backup copy to an offline server located in Switzerland. The evidence was irrefutable, perfectly packaged, and ready for immediate deployment. I looked over at the sofa. Lily was fast asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful, one small hand clutching her stuffed bear. I had promised her a safe adventure, far away from their poison. I was going to deliver on that promise by ensuring that the people currently trapped in a windowless, vibrating cabin at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean could never hurt us or anyone else ever again. I reached for my phone, my fingers completely steady. I did not waste a single second indulging in tears or shock. I pulled up my encrypted contacts list and tapped the number for Evelyn Thorne. Evelyn was a managing partner at a boutique, high-powered law firm in Manhattan that specialized exclusively in high-stakes corporate litigation and white-collar criminal defense. I had crossed paths with her during a massive corporate embezzlement audit 2 years ago, and we had maintained a fierce, unspoken mutual respect ever since. It was mid-morning in Hawaii, which meant it was late afternoon on the East Coast. Evelyn answered on the second ring. I bypassed the pleasantries and delivered a swift clinical briefing of the situation. I outlined the forged signatures, the predatory shadow loans, and the staggering $842,000 in stolen funds funneled through shell accounts directly into offshore crypto wallets. I heard the sharp, aggressive scratch of Evelyn's pen against a legal pad through the receiver. She did not offer empty sympathy. She offered immediate, catastrophic legal firepower. Within 10 minutes, we had established a comprehensive strategy for a total offensive strike. While Evelyn mobilized her elite legal team to prepare the necessary affidavits and injunctions, I kept my phone on speaker and began my own tactical assault. I opened secure tabs for Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. With a few rapid, decisive keystrokes, I initiated a hard, absolute freeze on my Social Security number and my entire credit profile. No new accounts could be opened, no existing lines could be extended, and any ongoing credit inquiries initiated by Thomas would instantly trigger a severe federal red flag. Next, I navigated to the official portals for the Federal Trade Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I systematically filed comprehensive identity theft reports, logging the exact dates, amounts, and suspected domestic origins of the fraudulent loans. I was completely severing the parasitic cord. I contacted my primary bank and placed a massive fraud alert on my personal identity, explicitly flagging Thomas, Brenda, Melanie, and Jamal as known hostile actors. I legally revoked any presumed implied or historical financial permissions that might have somehow lingered in the fine print of my past generosity. I locked down my tax portals with the IRS, preventing anyone from filing a fraudulent return to intercept a refund. I was no longer an accessible entity in their financial universe. I was a concrete wall surrounded by legal razor wire. Once my credit was locked down tight, I initiated the transfer of the dossier. I utilized a heavily encrypted self-destructing secure file transfer protocol to send the massive digital archive directly to Evelyn's private legal server. The upload progress bar crept across my screen, representing the complete digital distillation of my father's hubris and my brother's pathetic greed. When the transfer reached 100%, Evelyn confirmed receipt. She reviewed the preliminary data mapping and the Internet Protocol address logs I had successfully traced back to my former guest bedroom. Her voice over the phone was sharp with professional satisfaction. She assured me the paper trail was not just solid, it was a pristine, unassailable path leading directly to a grand jury indictment. Evelyn promised to contact the Federal Fraud Division and the FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center directly, leveraging her elite network to ensure the case landed on the desk of the most aggressive federal prosecutor available. I closed the laptop, the soft click of the magnetic latch, sounding like a heavy steel vault, locking into place in the quiet luxury of the suite. The digital battlefield was secure. I had armored up, completely surrounding myself and my daughter with an impenetrable fortress of elite legal representation and federal fraud protections. I walked over to the sofa where Lily was still sleeping peacefully, her small chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. I brushed a soft, dark curl from her forehead, feeling a profound, fierce wave of protective love. I had done it. I had broken the chain. They would never be able to steal our future. The next 3 days in Oahu were pure, unadulterated paradise. Without the looming dread of returning to that toxic household, I finally allowed myself to truly exhale. Lily and I swam in the warm ocean, learned how to paddleboard from a patient local instructor, and ate towering plates of shaved ice covered in sweet tropical syrups. We explored the island, driving a rented convertible with the top down, singing loudly to the radio, while the sun kissed our skin. I kept my phone strictly on silent, allowing the urgent, panicked voicemails from the middle of the Pacific Ocean to pile up, completely ignored in my digital inbox. I knew the terrible cruise was ending. I knew the ship was finally docking back on the mainland. We were sitting at a beautiful beachfront restaurant, enjoying a quiet dinner of fresh grilled mahi-mahi, when my phone suddenly vibrated against the wooden table. The screen illuminated, displaying an incoming text message. I swiped the screen, fully expecting another one of Thomas's empty, raging threats. Instead, the message was from Brenda. The text was a frantic, chaotic burst of fury. It painted a pathetic, highly satisfying picture of their current reality. We had to beg Jamal's friends for money to buy cheap flights home. "Pack your bags, you are dead to us." I read the message twice, marveling at her absolute delusion. After stealing nearly $1 million and treating me like a disposable bank, she actually believed she still held the authority to disown me. She actually believed I was waiting at home, trembling in fear, ready to be discarded and punished. I looked across the table at Lily, who was happily coloring on her tropical placemat, her face glowing with health and genuine happiness. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering steadily over the keypad. I did not type out a long emotional explanation. I did not mention the federal fraud alerts, the frozen credit, or the high-powered attorney currently dismantling their entire existence. I simply typed a single cheerful sentence: "Have a safe flight." 7 days had elapsed since I hit send on that final cheerful message from the Hawaiian beachfront. The tropical vacation had concluded, and Lily and I had seamlessly transitioned into our new, highly secure reality. Our new home was a sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse, situated in a luxury high-rise downtown, miles away from the stifling, toxic suburban neighborhood I had previously occupied. The building was a fortress of glass and steel, featuring biometric security scanners, dedicated private elevators, and a 24-hour concierge desk. Lily was currently in her massive new playroom, happily building a towering fortress out of colorful magnetic blocks, completely oblivious to the impending suburban drama unfolding across town. I sat comfortably at the pristine quartz kitchen island, a fresh cup of dark roast coffee steaming beside my laptop. The high-resolution screen was divided into a grid displaying crisp, real-time feeds from the exterior security cameras of my former house. When I negotiated the expedited cash sale with M&B Investments, I had insisted on one highly specific non-negotiable condition. The blind corporate entity had granted me a 7-day temporary access pass to the exterior surveillance network. It was a minor technicality for a multi-million-dollar real estate conglomerate, but for me it was the ultimate front-row ticket. I needed to witness the exact moment their fabricated reality collapsed. I had been monitoring the feed intermittently all morning. Because I had systematically frozen the corporate accounts and revoked every ounce of their financial access, they had been forced to beg, borrow, and scrape just to secure the cheapest, most agonizing travel itinerary possible. Right on schedule, a dented economy-tier rideshare sedan pulled up to the curb of the pristine suburban lawn. The rear doors swung open, and the returning royalty finally spilled out onto the pavement. The visual contrast from the day they had departed for their luxury cruise was nothing short of spectacular. They looked absolutely ravaged. Thomas emerged first, his face a painful, alarming shade of crimson. It was a combination of severe tropical sunburn and pure, unadulterated fury. He was wearing a wrinkled linen shirt that had clearly been slept in for 2 days across multiple budget airport layovers. Brenda followed her usually immaculate salon-styled hair, a tangled frizzy mess. She was aggressively dragging a heavy oversized suitcase across the rough asphalt, completely abandoning her usual air of upper-middle-class superiority. Melanie stepped out of the vehicle whining audibly. The camera's highly sensitive exterior microphone picked up her shrill voice immediately. She was complaining about a broken wheel on her designer luggage and the faint smell of smoke in the rideshare vehicle. Jamal emerged last, trying to maintain his fake crypto king swagger, but failing miserably. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped as he hauled his own bags out of the trunk without offering to help his mother or sister. The rideshare driver sped off before the trunk was even fully closed, clearly eager to escape the toxic cloud of entitlement radiating from his passengers. The 4 of them stood at the bottom of the driveway surveying the property. The house looked exactly as it always had from the street, giving no hint of the sterile, stripped-down void that lay behind the heavy oak front door. Thomas pointed a rigid, furious finger toward the living room windows. "I want her out within 5 minutes." His voice boomed through the audio feed, raw and grating. "Do not even let her pack her bags. We are throwing every single piece of her garbage directly onto the front lawn. If she tries to argue, I am calling the police and having her arrested for trespassing in my home." The sheer blinding arrogance of his statement made me smile into my coffee cup. He still genuinely believed he was the master of the domain. Brenda nodded in fierce agreement, her face twisted into a vicious sneer. "She is going to learn exactly what happens when you disrespect this family," she snapped, marching aggressively up the paved walkway. "She thinks she can just cut off my credit cards and leave us stranded at a port. I am going to make sure she has absolutely nothing left." They moved in a tight, angry formation up the steps to the front porch. Jamal pushed his way to the front of the pack, pulling a heavy ring of keys from his pocket. He puffed out his chest, stepping up to the deadbolt with an air of profound, unearned authority. He was ready to lead the charge, ready to physically intimidate his older sister and reclaim his stolen throne in the guest bedroom. He jammed his key toward the lock. It did not slide in. Jamal frowned, pulling the key back and inspecting it. He leaned closer to the heavy brass fixture, squinting in the bright morning sunlight. He tried to force the key into the cylinder again, jiggling it violently. A harsh metallic scraping sound echoed through the microphone. The key stubbornly refused to turn. The internal pins were entirely different. "What is taking so long?" Thomas barked, stepping up onto the porch and crowding Jamal. "Just open the damn door." "It is not fitting," Jamal muttered, his voice losing a fraction of its bravado. He grabbed the heavy door handle and yanked it downward. The door remained perfectly resolutely solid. It did not budge a single millimeter. M&B Investments had not just casually rekeyed the house. Their rapid response preservation team had installed commercial-grade high-security steel deadbolts on every single exterior entry point the moment the ink on the contract was dry. "Give me that!" Thomas snapped, snatching the keyring from his son's hand. He shoved Jamal aside and attacked the lock himself, his face turning a deeper, more dangerous shade of purple as the metal ground fruitlessly against the new cylinder. He pounded a heavy fist against the solid oak wood. "Cassidy, open this door right now. You are done. It is over." Silence greeted his demands. The house was a tomb. Brenda stepped back, her hands resting aggressively on her hips, her eyes scanning the exterior of the property for any sign of movement. She looked past the porch, her gaze sweeping over the perfectly manicured flower beds I had once maintained. Suddenly, she froze. Her posture went completely rigid. "Thomas," she whispered, the vicious anger draining from her voice in an instant, replaced by a hollow, creeping confusion. "What?" he yelled, still aggressively rattling the unyielding doorknob. Melanie noticed it next. She dropped the handle of her broken suitcase, letting it clatter loudly onto the concrete driveway. She pointed a trembling finger toward the center of the front lawn. "Dad, look!" Thomas finally turned away from the locked door. Following his daughter's pointing finger, his eyes landed on the sprawling green grass. Bolted deeply into the turf, positioned squarely facing the street for maximum visibility, was a massive, highly reflective metal sign. The black and white industrial lettering caught the morning sunlight, flashing its message with cold, absolute legal authority. Jamal slowly read the words aloud, his voice dropping into a stunned, breathless void. "Property of M&B Investments, no trespassing." The words hung in the crisp morning air, captured with pristine clarity by the high-definition audio feed transmitting directly to my penthouse kitchen island. For a long, agonizing moment, absolute silence reigned on the front porch. The four of them simply stood there, frozen like statues, staring at the uncompromising metal sign as if it were an alien artifact that had suddenly plummeted from the sky and landed on their perfectly manicured grass. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool quartz countertop, my eyes tracking every micro-expression displaying across my monitor. Thomas broke the silence first. A harsh, humorless scoff erupted from his chest. He shook his head violently, refusing to let the reality of the situation penetrate his deeply ingrained ego. He waved a dismissive hand at the sign, turning back to the locked door. He loudly proclaimed that this was nothing more than a pathetic, childish prank. He told the rest of them that I was throwing a tantrum over the revoked cruise tickets and had hired some local neighborhood kids to bolt a fake sign to the lawn just to scare them. He firmly believed his own fiction. He demanded that Jamal stop staring at the grass and figure out how to bypass the deadbolt immediately so he could get inside and pack my belongings into garbage bags. But Melanie was not operating under her father's blanket of denial. The exhaustion of the budget flights, the broken luggage, and the sheer heat of the morning sun had already stripped away her patience. She stepped awkwardly off the concrete porch, her expensive heels sinking slightly into the soft earth, and marched directly up to the metal sign. She traced the engraved black lettering with a manicured finger, realizing it was heavy industrial-grade steel, not a cheap plastic prop. The terrifying reality of her situation suddenly snapped into focus. This was not a prank. She was locked out of her own life. Absolute panic took hold. Melanie spun around, her face pale, and let out a shrill, piercing shriek that caused the audio monitors on my laptop to briefly peek into the red zone. She abandoned her broken suitcase on the driveway, sprinted back up the steps, and threw herself at the large picture windows flanking the front door. She cupped her hands around her face, pressing her nose against the reinforced glass, desperately trying to peer into the living room. Because M&B Investments had brought in a rapid response preservation crew, the interior of the house was completely devoid of our familiar furniture. The plush sofas, the Persian rugs, the framed family photographs. Everything had been entirely liquidated or removed. Melanie saw nothing but sterile, empty hardwood floors and freshly painted white walls. The shock broke her completely. She began slapping her open palms rhythmically against the glass, screaming my name over and over again, her voice echoing violently down the quiet, affluent suburban street. She demanded that I stop hiding, open the door, and let her inside to get her expensive skincare products. She beat on the glass like a trapped bird, oblivious to the fact that she was currently assaulting an empty corporate-owned asset. Seeing his daughter devolve into a shrieking mess finally shattered Thomas's thin veneer of control. The man who had spent his entire life solving problems through intimidation and sheer volume found himself facing an opponent that simply could not be bullied. A house does not care if you yell at it. A commercial-grade deadbolt does not flinch when you threaten its livelihood. Stripped of his usual weapons, Thomas resorted to brute force. He stepped up to the solid oak door, squared his broad shoulders, and began furiously hammering his closed fists against the wood. The heavy thudding reverberated through the camera feed. He bellowed demands, cursing my name, kicking the base of the door with his heavy travel shoes. He was completely out of control, a patriarch trying to beat a building into submission. While her husband and daughter actively assaulted the property, Brenda experienced an entirely different, vastly more agonizing brand of horror. The neighborhood we lived in was governed by a strict homeowners association. It was a pristine, fiercely quiet cul-de-sac where lawn lengths were measured in millimeters and public disturbances were considered cardinal sins. The cacophony of Melanie's shrieking and Thomas's furious pounding was an unforgivable breach of suburban etiquette. Brenda looked over her shoulder, her eyes wide with terror. I watched through the panoramic camera angle as the inevitable audience began to gather. Across the street, the heavy mahogany door of the Henderson residence swung open, and Mrs. Henderson stepped out onto her porch, a tiny lapdog clutched in her arms, her eyes wide with undisguised curiosity. 2 houses down, a retired cardiologist stopped watering his immaculate rose bushes, letting the hose droop to the ground as he stared openly at the spectacle unfolding on my driveway. A slow-moving delivery truck tapped its brakes, the driver pausing to watch the chaotic scene. Brenda was mortified. Her meticulously curated image as the wealthy, poised matriarch of a perfect, successful family was disintegrating in real time in front of the very people she spent years trying to impress. She frantically grabbed Thomas by the sleeve of his wrinkled linen shirt, aggressively shushing him. She hissed through her teeth, pointing wildly at the growing audience of affluent neighbors, begging her husband to stop making a scene before they became the laughingstock of the entire subdivision. Jamal, deeply embarrassed by his parents' public meltdown and feeling an urgent need to reassert his masculine authority, pushed his mother aside. He marched up to the door, shoving his father out of the way. He zeroed in on the sleek, heavy-duty digital keypad M&B Investments had installed directly above the deadbolt mechanism. Jamal clearly thought this was a standard residential smart lock, the kind of flimsy consumer hardware he was accustomed to seeing. He pulled a heavy metal multi-tool from his pocket, flipped open a flathead screwdriver attachment, and aggressively jammed it into the seam of the digital casing. He muttered that he just needed to pop the faceplate off, to short out the battery terminal, fully intending to force a manual override of the locking mechanism. It was a spectacularly stupid decision. M&B Investments did not use residential consumer hardware. They utilized industrial commercial-grade security systems designed specifically to secure vacant multi-million-dollar properties against aggressive squatters and organized vandalism. The keypad was wired directly to an internal tamper circuit. The exact millisecond Jamal's metal tool breached the waterproof seal of the casing, the circuit broke. The response was instantaneous and deafening. A blinding high-intensity strobe light mounted under the front eaves began flashing with a violent, disorienting rhythm. A fraction of a second later, the primary alarm siren triggered. This was not a standard high-pitched beep. It was a localized, ear-splitting industrial klaxon designed to alert an entire city block to a felony in progress. The sheer volume of the alarm was staggering. Jamal dropped his multi-tool onto the porch as if it had burned him, clapping both hands tightly over his ears. Melanie shrieked, stumbling backward down the steps and nearly tripping over her own abandoned suitcase. Brenda covered her face, completely humiliated as the deafening siren drew even more neighbors out of their homes. Through the chaos, the strobe lights and the blaring siren, Thomas finally broke from reality. Driven by decades of blind, unyielding entitlement, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. I watched in absolute fascination as he angrily dialed 911. He held the phone to his ear, his face contorted in a mask of righteous fury, completely oblivious to the fact that he was currently trespassing on corporate property. He began screaming over the blaring security alarm, demanding that the police send a squad car immediately to arrest the criminal squatters who had brazenly stolen his home. The shrill, rhythmic screech of the industrial alarm continued to assault the microphone on my security feed, completely drowning out whatever furious demands Thomas was attempting to scream at the 911 dispatcher. He was pacing the length of the concrete porch, like a rabid animal trapped in a cage, his face violently red spit flying from his lips as he yelled into his cell phone. Brenda had retreated to the edge of the driveway, desperately trying to hide her face from the gathering crowd of affluent neighbors. Melanie sat on her broken suitcase, sobbing audibly, while Jamal hovered near the edge of the lawn, completely stripped of his bravado and looking around nervously as if expecting a SWAT team to drop from the sky. Sitting in my quiet, climate-controlled penthouse, I took another sip of my dark roast coffee. I adjusted the volume on my laptop, ensuring I would not miss a single syllable of the impending collision between my father's unchecked arrogance and the absolute reality of municipal law enforcement. Less than 7 minutes after Thomas initiated his frantic call, the quiet suburban street was bathed in the harsh, rotating glare of red and blue lights. Two marked police cruisers turned sharply onto the cul-de-sac, their tires screeching slightly as they pulled up and parked at aggressive angles, effectively blockading the driveway. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicles. They moved with cautious, practiced efficiency, their hands resting loosely near their utility belts as they visually assessed the chaotic, noisy scene. The moment Thomas saw the uniforms, his entire demeanor shifted. He pocketed his phone, puffed out his chest, and marched down the porch steps with the absolute unearned confidence of a man who firmly believed the world existed solely to serve his needs. He approached the lead officer, extending a hand as if welcoming a subordinate to a golf club. He began shouting over the deafening blare of the security siren, adopting a tone of exasperated patriarchal authority. He confidently informed the officers that there was no real emergency. He smoothly explained that his unstable, ungrateful daughter was simply having a hysterical meltdown inside the house and had locked her own family out onto the street. He waved a dismissive hand toward the massive metal M&B investments sign bolted to the lawn, loudly declaring it was a pathetic prank, a fake prop she had purchased to throw a tantrum over a minor family disagreement. He crossed his arms over his wrinkled linen shirt and explicitly demanded that the officers breach the front door, remove the squatter from his property, and let him inside so he could teach his daughter a lesson in respect. The lead officer did not shake Thomas's hand. He did not smile. He simply stared at my father with a flat, unimpressed expression. He raised his radio to his shoulder and requested dispatch to contact the property management company attached to the commercial alarm permit to have the siren remotely deactivated. Less than 30 seconds later, the ear-splitting klaxon abruptly cut off. The sudden silence that fell over the driveway was heavy and absolute, broken only by the low hum of the idling police cruisers and Melanie's pathetic sniffling. With the noise eliminated, the lead officer pulled out a notepad. He asked Thomas for a government-issued identification card and a current utility bill proving his residency at the address. Thomas scoffed, rolling his eyes as he pulled his wallet from his pocket. He handed over his driver's license with a flourish, loudly stating that he did not need a utility bill because he was the patriarch of the family, and his name was on the mailbox. He instructed the officer to stop wasting time with paperwork and go break down the door. The officer ignored the command. He handed the license to his partner, instructing him to run the identification and cross-reference the property deed through the municipal database. While the second officer retreated to the cruiser's onboard computer, the lead officer turned his attention back to Thomas. He calmly pointed out the heavy commercial keypad, the reinforced steel deadbolt, and the very real legally mandated industrial warning sign bolted to the grass. He informed my father that residential homes do not utilize corporate vacant property security systems unless ownership has fundamentally transferred. Thomas's face flushed a deeper, more dangerous shade of purple. He stepped forward, invading the officer's personal space, his voice rising into a furious bark. He insisted that the house belonged to him, that he paid the bills, and that he had lived there comfortably for years. He aggressively poked a thick index finger at the officer's chest, a profound mistake born of decades of bullying people who could not fight back. The officer immediately stepped back, his hand dropping to his belt, issuing a sharp, undeniable verbal warning for Thomas to maintain his distance. Brenda gasped, rushing forward to grab her husband's arm, desperately trying to pull him back, before he managed to get himself tased on their front lawn in front of the entire neighborhood. The second officer emerged from the cruiser holding a printed dispatch slip. The digital autopsy was complete. He walked up to his partner and delivered the fatal blow to Thomas's fabricated reality. The officer stated clearly, his voice carrying perfectly across the audio feed, that the property at this address was no longer owned by Cassidy. The deed had been legally, irrevocably transferred and recorded by the county clerk days ago. The house was currently the exclusive corporate asset of M&B Investments, a blind holding trust. The officer turned his gaze directly onto my father. He asked Thomas if he possessed a current legally binding lease agreement authorized by M&B Investments. Thomas stammered, his jaw working uselessly as the absolute finality of the situation finally breached his thick skull. He had no lease. He had no deed. He had absolutely no legal right to stand on that concrete driveway. He began to frantically argue, claiming fraud, claiming identity theft, claiming that his daughter had illegally sold the property out from under him. The lead officer cut him off mid-sentence. He stated with cold, unyielding professional authority that any disputes regarding property sales or family finances were civil matters to be handled in a courtroom. However, the immediate reality was entirely criminal. The property management company had confirmed via dispatch that the house was officially vacant. No tenants were authorized. The individuals currently standing on the lawn had triggered a commercial security perimeter and were in direct violation of municipal law. The officer stepped forward, closing the distance Thomas had previously tried to command. He looked at my father, then at Brenda, Melanie, and Jamal. He delivered a formal, undeniable police ultimatum. They had exactly 10 minutes to gather their broken luggage, step off the pavement, and permanently vacate the corporate premises. If any of them remained on the grass or touched the front door after that 10-minute window expired, they would be immediately handcuffed, placed in the back of the cruiser, and formally arrested for criminal trespassing. The 10-minute warning hung in the air, absolute and unforgivable. The police officers did not blink. They rested their hands casually on their duty belts, watching with stony, unwavering professionalism as the countdown officially commenced. Thomas, a man who had navigated his entire adult existence relying entirely on bluster, intimidation, and the assumption that rules did not apply to him, finally realized he was entirely outmatched. The heavy steel of the police cruiser, the flashing lights, and the very real threat of handcuffs effectively crushed his rebellion. His broad shoulders slumped. The deep, furious purple hue of his face drained away rapidly, leaving a sickly, pale sheen of pure defeat. He did not utter another word of protest. He turned his back on the officers, grabbed the handle of his scuffed carry-on bag, and began the agonizing march of shame down the concrete driveway. Brenda let out a soft, mortified whimper. She scrambled to gather her oversized, broken luggage, her face burning with humiliation as she felt the judgmental stares of her former neighbors boring into her back. The retired cardiologist across the street was now openly leaning against his brick mailbox, watching the spectacle with undeniable amusement. Mrs. Henderson had even taken out her smartphone, holding it horizontally, clearly recording the glorious, highly public eviction of the neighborhood terror. Melanie continued to sob loudly, her expensive makeup running in dark, sticky streaks down her sunburned cheeks. Jamal silently grabbed his duffel bags, his head bowed, and trudged toward the street. The four of them crossed the property line, stepping off the manicured grass and onto the harsh municipal pavement of the curb. The police officers remained in the driveway standing guard until the family was entirely off the premises. The cruiser inched forward slightly, sealing the boundary. They were now standing on public property flanked by their ruined luggage, officially and utterly homeless. Inside the serene, climate-controlled environment of my downtown penthouse, I watched the final moments of their eviction play out on my high-resolution monitor. The absolute silence of my kitchen was a stark, beautiful contrast to the chaotic visual of my family stranded on a suburban sidewalk. I picked up my smartphone from the quartz countertop. The screen was dark, but the small notification light was pulsing with a frantic, steady rhythm. I had kept the device on absolute silent mode since the moment we boarded the plane in Honolulu. Now I tapped the glass screen to wake it up. The notification center was a solid wall of desperate, angry red text. There were dozens of furious text messages, an avalanche of notifications from blocked social media accounts, and a staggering backlog of missed calls. I scrolled down the list. 65, 66, 67 missed calls, all originating from Thomas, Brenda, or Jamal. They had been relentlessly bombarding my number since the second they realized their luxury cruise tickets were invalid, and the panic had clearly escalated into pure frenzy upon arriving at the locked house. Right on cue, the phone screen illuminated brightly in my hand, vibrating silently against my palm. An incoming call from Thomas. It was the 68th attempt. I looked at the live camera feed on my laptop screen. Thomas was standing on the curb, his phone pressed aggressively to his ear, his face twisted in a mask of total desperation and unhinged rage. He was pacing back and forth along the gutter, occasionally kicking at the side of his suitcase. Brenda was sitting directly on the concrete curb next to Melanie, her head buried deep in her hands. I had let them stew in the consequences of their actions long enough. The trap was perfectly set. The evidence was secured in a pristine digital vault, and Evelyn Thorne, my elite attorney, was fully prepped for the final devastating strike. I took a slow, deep breath, cleared my throat, and pressed the green button to accept the call. I brought the phone to my ear but did not say a single word. The connection opened, and a tidal wave of pure, unfiltered hostility immediately blasted through the receiver. Thomas did not offer a greeting. He did not ask for an explanation. He simply detonated. "You vicious, ungrateful little monster!" His voice roared through the speaker, hoarse and vibrating with a level of raw rage I had never heard before. "What the hell do you think you are doing? You sold my house. You locked us out on the street. I am going to destroy you for this. Do you hear me? I am going to hire the most ruthless, expensive lawyers in this city. I will drag you into civil court. I will sue you for every single penny you have ever made, and I will personally ensure you are left with absolutely nothing. You are going to be begging me for a place to sleep by the time I am done with you." He paused, gasping for air, and the shrill, frantic voice of Brenda instantly filled the temporary void. She was clearly standing right next to the phone, screaming directly into the receiver. "How could you do this to your own mother?" Brenda wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria. "After everything I sacrificed to raise you, we are your family. A family sticks together. A daughter is supposed to respect her parents, not throw them out like garbage in front of the entire neighborhood. You have no respect. You are a sick, twisted girl, and you are going to pay for what you have done to us today." Thomas snatched the narrative back, his voice dropping into a low, menacing growl. He promised to call my employer and sabotage my career. He promised to ruin my reputation in the city. He promised to take custody of Lily, loudly claiming I was clearly mentally unstable and entirely unfit to be a mother. He hurled every threat he could summon desperately, trying to find the emotional trigger that would make me fold, apologize, and surrender my power back to him. I sat perfectly still at the kitchen island listening to the frantic, dying gasps of their authority. I let them scream until their lungs burned. I let them exhaust their entire arsenal of manipulation and fear. When Thomas finally ran out of breath, expecting me to break down crying or frantically attempt to defend myself, a heavy, expectant silence fell over the line. I could hear the distant sound of suburban traffic and Melanie's muffled sobbing in the background. I stared at the camera feed, watching my father panting heavily on the curb. My heart was not racing, my palms were not sweating. I felt nothing but cold, clinical detachment. "I will see you tomorrow at 9 in the morning at my lawyer's office." My voice was ice cold, cutting through the line with absolute surgical precision. "Bring the paperwork for the fraudulent loans you took out in my name. Bring Jamal, too." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, instantly cutting off his shocked gasp and severing the connection completely. The silence in my penthouse felt like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. I did not spend the rest of the evening pacing the floor or worrying about the fallout. I ordered a high-end meal, played games with my daughter until her bedtime, and then slept for 8 solid dreamless hours. The morning sun crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my bedroom, signaling the dawn of my absolute emancipation. I rose early, moving with deliberate, unhurried purpose. Today was not about emotion. Today was about execution. I showered, stepping into my walk-in closet to select my armor for the final battle. I bypassed the soft knits and casual wear I usually favored. Instead, I pulled out a tailored charcoal gray designer suit that fit with razor-sharp precision. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and severe pointed-toe stilettos. I pulled my dark hair back into a flawless tight chignon that allowed no loose strands to escape. My makeup was minimal, consisting of sharp contours and a muted matte lip. I looked exactly like what I had become, a cold, untouchable executive who no longer dealt in family guilt or suburban manipulation. The law offices of Thorne and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a premier commercial skyscraper in the financial district. The environment was designed to intimidate, featuring vast expanses of frosted glass, imported Italian marble floors, and an atmosphere of hushed, terrifyingly expensive competence. Evelyn Thorne was already waiting for me in her primary corner conference room when I arrived at 8:45. She wore a pristine navy blazer, her legal pads perfectly aligned, her demeanor radiating the apex predator energy that had made her a legend in corporate litigation. We did not engage in small talk. We sat side by side at the head of a massive polished mahogany table, watching the heavy glass doors, waiting for the circus to arrive. At 9:14, they finally appeared. The receptionist escorted them down the long corridor, her face an unreadable mask of professional politeness as she guided the chaotic quartet into the pristine room. The visual contrast between our side of the table and theirs was staggering. My family looked like a complete, unmitigated disaster. Having their funds instantly frozen and being barred from the property had clearly forced them into whatever cheap cash only roadside motel they could scrape together enough pocket change to afford. Thomas wore the exact same wrinkled, sweat-stained linen shirt from the day before, his face puffy and his eyes bloodshot from a severe lack of sleep and an abundance of rage. Brenda looked physically diminished. Her posture slumped, her expensive handbag clutched tightly to her chest like a desperate shield. She smelled faintly of stale motel air and cheap industrial cleaner. Melanie was a chaotic mess of smeared mascara and unwashed hair, shivering slightly in the heavily air-conditioned room. Jamal trailed behind them, nervously adjusting the collar of a crumpled polo shirt, trying desperately to project a sense of control that his trembling hands completely betrayed. They stood near the doorway for a long moment, intimidated by the sheer wealth and power radiating from the room, before Thomas aggressively pulled out a chair and dropped into it. The others followed suit, clustering together on the opposite side of the sprawling mahogany slab. Melanie did not wait for introductions. She immediately launched into her practiced theatrical victim routine. Tears welled up in her eyes as she leaned forward, pointing an accusing manicured finger in my direction. She shrieked that I was a monster, claiming I had subjected her to unforgivable emotional abuse. She sobbed about how I had traumatized her, how she had been forced to sleep on a lumpy mattress, in a room that smelled like mildew, and how her entire life was ruined because of my selfish, vindictive tantrum. She demanded a formal apology, insisting that my actions were a form of psychological violence that she would never recover from. I did not blink. I simply watched her perform my expression, a blank, frozen canvas. Sensing that his sister's emotional display was failing to gain any traction, Jamal decided to step up and seize the narrative. He puffed out his chest, attempting to aggressively posture as the legal authority of the family. He slammed his palms flat on the table and began spouting a rapid-fire stream of legal jargon he had clearly absorbed from late-night television or a panicked internet search in the motel lobby. He loudly accused me of constructive eviction and illegal detainer. He claimed they had established squatter rights and adverse possession, declaring that my failure to provide 30 days written notice was a direct violation of municipal code. He threatened to sue me for punitive damages, defamation of character, and emotional distress, stringing the impressive-sounding words together into a completely incoherent, legally meaningless word salad. Evelyn Thorne did not even grant Jamal the dignity of a response. She simply raised a single perfectly sculpted eyebrow, her silence making him look like a foolish child playing dress-up in an adult's world. Jamal's voice faltered under her icy scrutiny, and he slowly sank back into his heavy leather chair, his bravado entirely evaporating. Thomas had finally had enough. He slammed a heavy fist onto the mahogany table, rattling the crystal water glasses placed in the center. He leaned forward, his face twisting into a familiar mask of paternal fury. He ignored Evelyn completely and locked his bloodshot eyes directly onto mine. He commanded me to end this pathetic charade immediately. He stated that I had overstepped my bounds, that I had disrespected the family hierarchy, and that I had absolutely no right to sell a house that fundamentally belonged to him. He demanded that I pick up my phone, call the investment firm, and reverse the sale right this second. He warned me that if I did not hand over the keys and restore his access to his home within the hour, I would face consequences I could not even begin to fathom. The room fell dead silent, the heavy air vibrating with his final desperate threat. Thomas sat back, his chest heaving, waiting for me to wither, waiting for the obedient, terrified daughter to surface and surrender. I did not utter a single word of defense. I did not justify my actions, nor did I return his anger. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on my lap. Without breaking eye contact with the man who had tormented me for my entire life, I gave a slow, barely perceptible nod to my left. Evelyn Thorne understood the cue perfectly. Moving with terrifying clinical grace, she reached beside her chair and retrieved the physical evidence of their destruction. Without a word, she slid 3 thick, heavy red folders across the polished mahogany table, letting them come to a halt directly in front of Thomas, Brenda, and Jamal. The 3 heavy red folders sat perfectly aligned on the polished mahogany table, a stark contrast to the chaotic, disheveled state of my family. The room was suffocatingly silent. For a long, tense minute, no one moved. Thomas glared at the folders as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. But his inherent arrogance, the desperate need to control the narrative, ultimately won out. He scoffed loudly, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed off the frosted glass walls, and snatched the first folder from the table. He flipped it open with aggressive force, clearly expecting a cease and desist letter or a meaningless civil threat he could easily ignore. Instead, his bloodshot eyes locked onto the heavy textured parchment of a finalized county recorded deed. It was the irrevocable bill of sale. Evelyn Thorne leaned forward, resting her perfectly manicured hands on the table, and began to speak with the calm, lethal precision of an executioner reading a sentence. She informed Thomas that the document he was holding was the undeniable proof that the property had been legally transferred to a blind corporate trust days before their eviction. She pointed a slender finger at the inside cover of the folder. Taped securely to the red cardboard was a single silver brass key. Evelyn did not raise her voice yet. Her words filled the room entirely. She explained that every single piece of furniture, every item of clothing, every photograph, and every meaningless trinket they owned had been meticulously inventoried, boxed by bonded professionals, and relocated to a climate-controlled unit at Secure Vault Storage on Fifth Avenue. Thomas let out a brief sigh of relief, assuming I had generously paid to store their lives. Evelyn quickly shattered that assumption. She smiled a terrifyingly sharp expression that did not reach her eyes. She clarified that the unit was indeed registered in Thomas's name, but the initial deposit only covered a strictly mandated 48-hour hold. That hold expired tomorrow at noon. If Thomas did not arrive at the facility with a certified cashier's check to cover the exorbitant first-month lease and the required security deposit by 12 o'clock sharp, the facility would legally assume ownership of the contents. They would initiate a lien and auction off their entire life accumulation to the highest bidder. Melanie let out a strangled gasp, whining loudly about her designer shoes and expensive handbags being held hostage, but Evelyn simply ignored her. Brenda, trembling visibly, reached for the second red folder. She pulled it toward her chest, hesitating before slowly peeling back the cover. Inside lay the glossy, colorful printouts of their highly anticipated Mediterranean luxury cruise itinerary. Stamped diagonally across the pristine images of the ocean liner in massive, unforgiving red ink was the word void. Beneath the canceled tickets lay a thick stack of financial statements. Evelyn shifted her gaze to my mother. She calmly outlined that every supplementary credit card, every authorized user account, and every joint line of credit they had been secretly leeching off my primary accounts for years had been permanently terminated. Furthermore, Evelyn directed Brenda's attention to the specific banking notices stapled to the back pages. The documents explicitly stated that the closures were not standard cancellations. The accounts were frozen and locked down due to formal investigations of suspected fraudulent activity. Brenda stared blankly at the pieces of physically cut plastic taped to the final page. Her breath hitched. The reality crashed down upon her. Her entire social currency, her endless shopping sprees, her catered luncheons with affluent friends, all of it was dead. She was financially stranded, holding nothing but canceled vacation tickets and useless plastic. Jamal, trying desperately to maintain his facade of legal expertise, reached out and confidently pulled the third and thickest folder toward his side of the table. Thomas leaned over heavily, his shoulder pressing against Jamal to read the document simultaneously. The cover page bore the embossed logo of a premier, internationally recognized cyber forensic auditing firm. The first page was a comprehensive executive summary detailing the exact amounts of the unauthorized fraudulent loans taken out in my name. Jamal immediately scoffed, rolling his eyes and loudly declaring that the paperwork proved absolutely nothing. He argued aggressively that anyone could have hacked the banking system, insisting that cybercrime was rampant and tracing digital theft to a specific individual was entirely impossible. Evelyn did not argue. She simply instructed Jamal to turn to page 4. As he flipped the heavy paper, Evelyn walked them through the forensic nightmare with surgical accuracy. She detailed the exact dates, the precise timestamps, and the specific digital signatures utilized to authorize the massive debt. She pointed to the highlighted sections revealing the Internet Protocol logs. The digital footprint was indisputable. The loan request did not originate from a random hacker in a foreign country. They pinged directly from the specific media access control address of the router securely located inside Thomas's home office. Jamal's confident smirk faltered slightly, but he tried to maintain his posture. He opened his mouth to argue that a neighbor could have stolen their wireless password, but Evelyn cut him off effortlessly. She directed him to the next highlighted paragraph. The security system had required a two-factor authentication code to finalize the loan distribution. The audit proved exactly where that text message had been routed. The authentication codes were intercepted by a device registered directly under Jamal's personal cellular plan. Then Evelyn delivered the final devastating blow. She turned to the cryptocurrency ledger attached to the back of the folder. The stolen funds were not just withdrawn and spent. They had been deliberately funneled through a complex series of digital crypto wallets in a desperate attempt to wash the money before it finally landed in offshore accounts controlled jointly by Thomas and Jamal. As Jamal and Thomas read the irrefutable, deeply technical audit, the visual transformation was absolute and immediate. The aggressive bluster vanished from the room. Jamal's broad shoulders collapsed inward, his eyes widening with genuine, unadulterated terror. He realized instantly that this was no longer a simple civil dispute over family money. This was a meticulously documented, comprehensively investigated roadmap for a federal indictment. Thomas stared at the pages, his mouth hanging slightly open. The realization hit them simultaneously with the force of a freight train. Federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, conspiracy to commit money laundering. They were staring directly at years in a federal penitentiary. The color completely drained from both of their faces, leaving them looking like hollow, fragile shells of the men who had walked into the room. The absolute, unyielding family loyalty they had preached about for decades evaporated in a single heartbeat. The instinct for pure self-preservation took over violently. Thomas jumped up from his chair, knocking it backward into the glass wall. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at his son, in-law screaming at the top of his lungs that Jamal had orchestrated the entire cryptocurrency scheme and had actively tricked him into signing the initial routing documents. Jamal instantly leaped to his feet, his face twisted in panic, firing back just as loudly. He screamed that it was entirely Thomas's idea to exploit my credit profile in the first place, and that Thomas had relentlessly bullied him into setting up the digital wallets. The United Family Alliance instantly shattered, dissolving into a vicious, panicked screaming match right in front of my eyes. The conference room instantly morphed into a war zone. The polished mahogany table became a physical barrier between two men who just yesterday had smugly toasted to my absolute ruin. Thomas's booming baritone clashed violently with Jamal's panicked, defensive shrieking. They hurled accusations with reckless abandon, each desperate to pin the federal crimes entirely on the other. Thomas, his face a horrifying shade of crimson, pounded his fists against the glass, demanding Jamal take the fall as the mastermind. Jamal, clutching the forensic audit like a shield, frantically flipped through the dense pages, his eyes darting across the itemized transactions in a desperate search for a loophole, an excuse, or a scapegoat. I sat perfectly still beside Evelyn, watching the beautiful, catastrophic implosion of their fabricated reality. We did not need to interrogate them. They were doing the prosecution's job for us, screaming their confessions into a room that I knew was being discreetly recorded for legal documentation. Then Jamal's frantic page turning abruptly stopped. His eyes locked onto a specific column of numbers detailing the wire transfers between the initial fraudulent loan disbursements and the secondary cryptocurrency wallets. The terrified panic on his face instantly crystallized into pure, venomous outrage. Jamal slammed his finger against the glossy paper and shoved it toward his father-in-law. His voice cracked as he pointed out a massive, glaring discrepancy. The total amount drawn from my credit profile did not match the deposits hitting his offshore accounts. Jamal shrieked the math aloud, the numbers echoing off the frosted glass. Thomas had secretly siphoned off a 20% handling fee before routing the remaining capital to Jamal's digital laundering operation. My father had actively embezzled from the very theft they had conspired to commit together. The revelation detonated like a live grenade. Jamal lost all sense of self-preservation and lunged across the table, grabbing the collar of Thomas's wrinkled linen shirt. He screamed that Thomas was a greedy, treacherous parasite who had set him up to take the fall while padding his own secret retirement fund. Thomas shoved Jamal backward with a violent thrust, barking that the 20% was his rightful tax for dealing with an incompetent, amateurish idiot who could not even code a secure firewall. He justified the theft as compensation for allowing Jamal to use the residential network, completely oblivious to the fact that he was confessing to wire fraud in front of my elite legal counsel. Melanie, who had been huddled in her chair nursing her own self-pity, suddenly snapped out of her stupor. The realization that her entire luxurious existence was funded by a bungled criminal conspiracy, and that her husband had been actively robbed by her own father, shattered her delicate, pampered illusion. She leaped to her feet, her high heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, and unleashed her fury entirely on Jamal. She slapped his shoulder, her voice reaching an ear-piercing pitch as she attacked his manhood, his intelligence, and his catastrophic failure to secure their wealth. She viciously reminded Jamal of the extravagant promises he had made, the luxury cars he had leased, and the designer lifestyle she had flaunted to her friends. Melanie screamed that she thought they were legitimately, independently wealthy, not living off stolen cash that he was too stupid to properly hide. She turned her wrath on Thomas next, accusing her father of stealing from his own daughter to fund Brenda's pathetic, desperate country club facade. The three of them tore into each other without mercy, a feeding frenzy of toxic vanity and shattered egos. They weaponized decades of hidden resentments, screaming about secret debts, hidden affairs, and pathetic social climbing, exposing every ugly, rotten secret they had kept buried beneath their manicured suburban exterior. Brenda sat utterly paralyzed amidst the deafening crossfire. The matriarch, who had dedicated her entire existence to cultivating an image of flawless affluence, watched her husband, daughter, and son-in-law cannibalize one another over stolen money. The credit card cut-off notices lay scattered in front of her, but the financial ruin was no longer her primary concern. As Thomas and Jamal threatened to testify against each other to the federal authorities, the terrifying reality finally breached Brenda's thick layer of denial. Her husband was facing multiple federal felonies. Her son-in-law was going to prison. Her daughter was destitute. The comfortable, dominant life she had ruthlessly guarded was gone forever. Brenda's perfectly maintained posture collapsed. A deep, guttural sob tore from her throat, cutting through the vicious arguments raging around her. She slipped out of her heavy leather chair, her knees hitting the imported Italian marble floor with a heavy thud. She crawled around the edge of the mahogany table, completely abandoning whatever shreds of dignity and superiority she had left. Her face was streaked with tears. Her mascara ruined her expression, twisted into a mask of pure primal desperation. She looked up at me from the floor, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. The shouting match between Thomas, Melanie, and Jamal slowly died down as they turned to stare at the matriarch groveling on the floor. Evelyn Thorne watched with cool professional detachment. I simply looked down at the woman who had spent my entire childhood making me feel invisible. Brenda reached out with a trembling hand, her voice cracking as she deployed the absolute ultimate manipulation tactic she had left in her pathetic arsenal. "Please, Cassidy, blood is thicker than water." The phrase "blood is thicker than water" echoed off the frosted glass walls of the conference room, hanging in the chilled, heavily air-conditioned air like a foul odor. The sheer audacity of the proverb, weaponized in the final seconds of their downfall, acted as a sudden mute button on the chaotic symphony of betrayal. Thomas froze, his mouth clamped shut, his chest still heaving from screaming at Jamal. Melanie ceased her shrill barrage of insults, her manicured hands dropping to her sides as she stared at her mother kneeling on the Italian marble. Jamal swallowed hard, stepping back from the table, his eyes darting wildly between Brenda and me. The absolute silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and entirely profound. It was the sound of decades of tyrannical authority completely collapsing. I remained perfectly still in my leather chair. I did not recoil. I did not flinch. I did not reach out to comfort the woman who had spent my entire existence molding me to serve her vanity. I looked down at Brenda. Her designer clothes were rumpled, her face streaked with tears and ruined makeup, her hands clasped tightly together in a pathetic mimicry of prayer. I studied her not with a daughter's compassion, but with the detached clinical observation of an executive auditing a failed bankrupt asset. When I finally spoke, my voice was not raised. It did not shake with unshed tears or vibrate with residual anger. It was perfectly level, a flat, emotionless frequency that cut through their desperation like a scalpel. Blood, I said, letting the word drop onto the polished mahogany table between us. You invoke blood now, Brenda, as if it is a magic spell. As if sharing a genetic sequence is some kind of universal currency that automatically pays off a lifetime of emotional bankruptcy. Brenda let out a small, pathetic whimper, her eyes wide, begging for a lifeline that I had permanently severed. You have always fundamentally misunderstood what that proverb means. I continued my gaze sweeping across the terrified faces of my father, my sister, and my brother-in-law before locking back onto my mother. You wielded the concept of family like a blunt instrument. It was your universal excuse for every boundary you violated, every privacy you invaded, and every shred of dignity you tried to strip from me. You demanded absolute loyalty, but you offered absolutely zero protection in return. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the cool glass edge of the table. The movement was slight, but it made Thomas flinch, his eyes instinctively darting to the thick red folders Evelyn Thorne was now casually stacking into a neat, terrifying pile. Blood didn't stop you from abandoning a 7-year-old girl. I stated my words, striking the room with the force of a physical blow. You expected me to subject Lily to the exact same emotional meat grinder that you forced me through. You viewed my daughter not as a human being, not as your granddaughter, but as a temporary inconvenience. An accessory you could ignore until you needed a prop for your fabricated perfect family portrait. When she needed patience, you offered judgment. When she needed warmth, you offered conditional approval. You abandoned her emotional well-being long before you ever tried to steal my financial security. Brenda opened her mouth to protest, a weak, stammering sound, but the absolute void of empathy in my eyes silenced her instantly. Family isn't a free pass for fraud and cruelty, I said, my voice dropping an octave, ringing with unmistakable finality. It is not a blank check you can cash to fund your vanity projects. It is not a shield you can hide behind when the federal authorities start tracking your stolen cryptocurrency. Jamal swallowed audibly, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Thomas looked physically ill, the reality of his impending criminal indictment suffocating him. I had to unlearn everything you taught me about what a family is supposed to be. I told them, my tone steady and completely devoid of the hysterical pitch they had tried to provoke. I had to redefine it from scratch. Family is respect. Family is protection. It is standing between the monsters of the world and the vulnerable people you are supposed to keep safe. It is unconditional love. I paused, letting the silence stretch, ensuring every single syllable penetrated their thick layers of denial. You failed to provide Lily with a single ounce of that protection. You failed to offer her anything resembling unconditional love. And in doing so, you proved to me that you are not my family. You are simply a group of toxic parasitic strangers who happen to share my address for a fraction of my life. You are a biological technicality, and as of today, that technicality has been permanently corrected. The devastation in the room was absolute. There were no more threats to hurl. There were no more legal loopholes for Jamal to fabricate. There was no more matriarchal guilt for Brenda to weaponize. They had exhausted their entire arsenal, and they had struck nothing but a fortified, impenetrable wall of pure indifference. Thomas opened his mouth, perhaps to issue one final pathetic demand, but his voice failed him. He simply stared at the red folders, his chest sinking. Melanie had stopped crying, her face a blank mask of ruined entitlement, as she realized her luxury ride was permanently over. I did not require an apology. I did not need closure. I had orchestrated my own justice, and the execution was flawlessly complete. Moving with calm, deliberate grace, I pushed my chair back from the mahogany table. I stood up, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my tailored charcoal skirt. I reached for my designer purse resting on the adjacent chair, my movements unhurried and completely relaxed. Evelyn Thorne remained seated, her hands folded neatly over the evidence files, her sharp eyes watching the broken quartet across the room like a hawk monitoring cornered prey. I slid the strap of my purse over my shoulder and casually adjusted the cuff of my crisp white blouse. I raised my left arm, pulling back the sleeve to glance briefly at the face of my silver watch. The movement was entirely dismissive, the ultimate punctuation mark on their total irrelevance. I looked up, my eyes sweeping over Thomas, Brenda, Melanie, and Jamal one last time. My meeting is over, I said, the cold, flat certainty of my voice sealing their fate. But yours is just beginning. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled, leaving behind a landscape defined not by dramatic showdowns or theatrical screaming matches, but by cold, unyielding reality. The seasons had changed, and with them the immutable consequences of their actions had fully taken root. I observed the fallout from a vast distance, detached and completely unaffected, reading the periodic legal updates provided by Evelyn with the same clinical objectivity one might use to review a competitor's bankruptcy filing. Thomas was the first to fall completely. The forensic audit had been absolutely airtight, a digital masterpiece that left no room for expensive legal maneuvering, high-priced defense attorneys, or backroom settlements. The federal prosecutors, armed with irrefutable evidence of offshore routing and stolen identity, offered zero leniency. Thomas was currently awaiting sentencing, facing severe prison time that would undoubtedly consume the remainder of his senior years. The staggering legal fees and the immediate federal seizure of his illicit assets had plunged him into total, irrevocable bankruptcy. His entire reputation, the patriarchal image of flawless corporate dominance he had spent decades meticulously cultivating, was reduced to ash. He was a disgraced, ruined man, stripped of his power, his wealth, and his freedom, sitting in a sterile detention center while the world moved on without him. Jamal did not fare any better. He remained under an active, suffocating federal investigation that scrutinized every single digital footprint he had ever left. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to save his own skin, he had immediately tried to throw Thomas under the bus, volunteering to testify against his father-in-law. However, his profound technical incompetence had left a paper trail so wide and incriminating that the federal authorities simply used his own panicked confessions to tighten the noose around his neck. His accounts were completely frozen, his professional licenses revoked, and his future practically non-existent. The sheer magnitude of his failure triggered a spectacular, highly public implosion of his marriage. Melanie, realizing that her husband was not a legitimate financial genius, but an amateurish criminal who had lost everything, initiated a bitter, vicious divorce. The proceedings became a local spectacle, dragging their toxic vanity into the harsh light of a public courtroom. Melanie fought like a cornered animal for assets that no longer existed, violently attacking Jamal for stripping her of the elite social status she felt inherently entitled to possess. They spent their remaining pennies destroying each other in civil court, fighting over worthless debt, while their respective federal indictments loomed overhead. With the corporate trust having legally auctioned off their stored possessions to cover the unpaid lease, Brenda and Melanie were abruptly thrust into a reality they had spent their entire lives mocking and avoiding. Stripped of their stolen credit cards, their luxury vehicles, and their sprawling estates, mother and daughter were forced to relocate to a cramped, low-income apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. There were no imported Italian marble floors, no vaulted ceilings, and certainly no country club luncheons. Their new existence was defined by thin, poorly insulated walls, stained linoleum that refused to look clean, and the constant jarring rumble of nearby highway traffic. They were entirely cut off from the luxury they once breathed like air. I could easily picture them sitting in that suffocating space, surrounded by cheap particle board furniture, wearing the few outdated clothes they had managed to pack in a single suitcase before the eviction. The supreme irony was that their current squalor was not a punishment inflicted upon them. It was simply the natural mathematical result of their own unmitigated greed and profound cruelty. They had built a massive house of cards using stolen funds, and my credit and gravity had finally, inevitably pulled it down to the dirt. I, however, sat in the sun-drenched kitchen of my own home, a space entirely funded by my own legitimate, honest hard work. The morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm, golden glow across the quiet room. Lily was upstairs, safely asleep, entirely insulated from the toxic chaos that had once threatened to consume her childhood. My design firm was thriving. My credit profile had been painstakingly restored and heavily fortified against future breaches, and my life was utterly peaceful. I poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee, breathing in the rich aroma, relishing the profound, unbroken silence of my absolute emancipation. There was no walking on eggshells, no waiting for the next psychological attack, and no sacrificing my daughter's emotional well-being to appease a narcissistic matriarch. I had severed the infected limb, and the patient had miraculously survived. Setting my coffee mug down on the smooth quartz counter, I opened my laptop to review the morning's schedule. Among the standard client inquiries and vendor updates, a single unread message sat in my inbox. The sender address belonged to Melanie. It had somehow managed to bypass my spam filters, a desperate digital intrusion from a ghost of my past. I hovered my cursor over the subject line and clicked. It was a long, rambling, frantic email. Melanie begged for a loan, pleading that the apartment was unlivable, that Brenda was sick with stress, that they just needed a few $1,000s to get back on their feet and secure legal representation. She utilized every manipulation tactic in their old, exhausted playbook, invoking sisterhood, family loyalty, and shared blood. I read the words, scanning the desperate, panicked paragraphs, and felt absolutely nothing. The emotional hooks found no purchase in my heart. I did not reply. I did not hesitate or second-guess my boundaries. With a single fluid click of the mouse, I hit the block button, permanently banishing her address to the void. I closed my laptop, the screen going black, and walked away from the table, leaving that dark, miserable life behind me forever. Leaving the kitchen island behind, I walked into the sprawling expanse of my sunlit living room, where the lingering shadows of the past instantly dissolved into the vibrant promise of the present. Today was not a day for looking backward or dwelling on the bitter consequences faced by strangers who once called themselves my blood. Today was a celebration of pure, unadulterated survival. It was Lily's 8th birthday, and the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse was rapidly transforming into a haven of absolute joy. I moved through the spacious area, sliding open the massive glass balcony doors to let the crisp, fresh air sweep through the rooms. The panoramic view of the city skyline sparkled brilliantly under the clear blue sky, a fitting, majestic backdrop for the spectacular life we had successfully fought to build. The caterers arrived precisely at noon, moving with seamless efficiency to set up a magnificent spread of food, followed closely by the decorators, who turned the sleek, modern space into a whimsical, colorful wonderland of pastel balloons and shimmering streamers. There was no Brenda hovering critically over the centerpieces, issuing sharp, degrading critiques about the quality of the floral arrangements or the choice of napkins. There was no Thomas loudly demanding that the music be turned down to accommodate his aggressive business calls. There was no Melanie rolling her eyes at the childish decor, sighing heavily at the inconvenience of celebrating a little girl. Instead, there was just a profound, pervasive sense of warmth and eager anticipation. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the penthouse was entirely filled with the resonant, beautiful hum of genuine laughter and lively conversation. The people who populated my home today were not bound to me by a shared genetic sequence or a forced toxic obligation. They were my carefully chosen family, my closest friends, the ones who had offered their couches, their wisdom, and their unwavering support. When my world was originally collapsing, stood chatting animatedly by the floor-to-ceiling windows. Even Evelyn Thorne made an appearance, trading her severe, intimidating courtroom armor for a soft cashmere sweater. She offered me a warm, genuine smile across the room, proving that her ruthless apex predator precision was a weapon reserved exclusively for protecting those she respected. Several of my top colleagues and loyal clients were there as well, treating me with the profound professional and personal respect I had rightfully earned. But the most important element of the entire room was the children. Lily was the absolute, undisputed center of attention, darting through the crowd with her school friends, her face flushed with authentic, uninhibited happiness. She was not relegated to a silent corner or harshly shushed for displaying too much energy. She was actively, wonderfully celebrated. I watched her spin around in a new dress she had proudly picked out herself, her laughter ringing out, clear and bright, entirely untainted by the heavy, suffocating anxiety that used to define our forced family gatherings. The adults engaged with her directly asked her thoughtful questions and actually listened to her animated, imaginative stories with authentic interest. She was surrounded by a community that viewed her as a precious treasure, not a disposable inconvenience. I stood near the balcony edge holding a glass of sparkling cider, simply absorbing the profound, stark contrast of my reality. I remembered the dark, miserable holidays spent desperately trying to win the approval of people who were fundamentally incapable of offering it. I remembered the constant grinding pressure to conform to a toxic vanity that actively drained my spirit and threatened to permanently infect my daughter. Looking at the vibrant, thriving reality of my present, the sterile, superficial world I had escaped felt like a distant, fated nightmare. While my former abusers were confined to their miserable, cramped apartment, drowning in their self-inflicted ruin, Lily and I were standing in the sunlight, enveloped in an abundance of light and unconditional affection. The lively conversation naturally lulled as the caterers dimmed the main lights and brought out the birthday cake. It was a massive, multi-tiered masterpiece glowing brightly with the warm light of 8 flickering candles. The entire room gravitated toward the center of the penthouse, forming a tight, supportive circle around Lily. As the collective voices of my true chosen family rose in a cheerful, beautifully off-key rendition of the birthday song, I moved to stand directly behind my daughter. I placed my hands gently on her small shoulders, feeling the vibrant, pulsing energy of her excitement. She looked up at me, her bright eyes reflecting the dancing flames, completely secure in the unshakable knowledge that she was entirely safe and infinitely loved. As Lily squeezed her eyes shut tight to make her secret wish, my mind drifted back to the initial catalyst of this entire journey. I thought about the cruel, abrupt text message I had received months ago, the digital eviction notice that had initially felt like the violent end of my world. At the time, that notification had seemed like a devastating tragedy, an ultimate heartless betrayal that was designed to leave me permanently broken and destitute. But standing here firmly enveloped in the warmth of true companionship and witnessing the absolute unfiltered joy radiating from my daughter, I realized exactly how profoundly wrong I had been. That message was not a tragedy. It was the key to the lock on my cage. The universe had not punished me. It had miraculously intervened. It had orchestrated a brutal, necessary severing to force me out of a toxic cycle I might never have possessed the courage to escape on my own. I finally understood the ultimate payoff of this entire ordeal. Sometimes being abruptly cut off by toxic people, even those who share your blood, is rarely a genuine loss. It is the universe's aggressive, magnificent way of saving you, of violently clearing away the dead weight and the poison to make room for the beautiful, supportive family you actually deserve. Lily took a deep, theatrical breath and blew out the candles in a single determined puff. The room instantly erupted in joyful applause and enthusiastic cheers. I pulled her into a tight, fierce embrace, burying my face in her shoulder and breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. The battle was officially over. The dark past was permanently buried. And as the bright afternoon sunlight streamed through the massive windows, washing away the final lingering traces of smoke from the extinguished candles, I knew with absolute unshakable certainty that our real life had finally, truly begun. The most profound lesson from Cassidy's journey is that biological ties do not excuse toxic behavior. For years, her family weaponized the concept of blood to exploit and manipulate her demanding unwavering loyalty, while offering only cruelty in return. Her ultimate triumph wasn't just surviving their financial betrayal, but recognizing that walking away is not a tragedy, it is an act of profound self-love. True family is built on mutual respect, protection, and unconditional support, not shared DNA. Sometimes losing toxic people is the universe's way of making room for real love. Have you ever had to set hard boundaries with toxic relatives? Share your story and comment below.